Hello and welcome. In this video we are going to take a look at how to get infinite distortion sounds using Ableton Live 12's multiband distortion unit raw and an effects rack. You can grab the rack I have made in the video description. Let's get into it. Disclaimer. This video contains loud noises. This is a warning for those that do not like loud noises. If you do not like loud noises, then I ask you politely but firmly to leave. If you do like loud noises, then you are being forewarned and I accept no liability for the following potential issues you may suffer from watching this video that contains loud noises. Potential issues may include hearing damage, bleeding from ears, smelly ear syndrome, hair loss, hair growth, dislocated reality unawareness syndrome, elephant feet, 1 month old salad, restless resting face, crazy eyes, pterodactyl wings, the sudden urge to nose fart, extra fingers, and finally dysentery. This is now the end of the disclaimer. Loud noises shall now commence in 3, 2, 1. This is the sound source that we're going to be affecting. I made this in a previous video called Industrial Cinematic Drums That Raw. So to start with, we're going to need two devices. First of all, we need raw, and secondly, we need glue compressor with soft clip turned on. You can replace this with Ableton Live's limiter if you want, or any other type of limiter. I just prefer to use glue compressor with soft clip turned on, because the more we push the signal through it, the more it gives a nice, warm crunch sound, which works well for the purposes of this. Next, you want to group these together and put them into an effects rack. On Mac, that's Command and G. On Windows, that is Control and G. Next, we want to put raw into multiband mode. So now we have those 3 bands available to use. I'm going to expand the view of raw just so we can see all of the bands together. This will make it easier to work with and start mapping things to macros. Now the main thing that we want to focus on here is the shapers, the levels, the amounts, the filter frequency and the filter type. You can also map other things as well, but we'll see how this works more as we've mapped everything to the macros. So let's quickly do that. Now for the amount and level, I'm going to map to the same macro, and I'm going to show you why as we start playing around with the macro settings. Now that we've mapped all of those, and if we expand out the effects rack macro view by pressing the plus button so we can see all 16 macros, you can see how I've mapped all of these together. Macro 1 is for the low band shaper type, macro 2 is for both the level and the amount, macro 3 for the filter 1 frequency, and macro for the filter 1 type. I've done this for the mid band and also the high band as well. Now the reason why I put a glue compressor with a soft clip turned on at the end of this is this will get very, very loud very quickly if we're not careful, and this will just stop anything from getting past 0 decibels. I would recommend that you turn your headphones down a little bit as you're building out this rack if you're working on it yourself, because you can get into dangerously loud territories. So what we can do now is basically just start pressing the randomize button and play the drums that we've got running through this channel back. Now, as you can see, some of these get very, very loud, but some are also very quiet at the same time. And with experimenting with this is where I found that by macroing the level and the amount together on the same macro, like we've got with macro 2, macro 6, and macro 10 here for the different bands, this allowed me to edit the macro mapping slightly so it wasn't jumping up and down massively in level. So if we press the map button, we can now go in and start editing some values. Also, if you want to make the mapping editing easier for yourself, you can change the color of the macro headers. So I'm going to turn all of the low band into a light green color, the mid band into a yellow color, and the high band into a red color. And now when we come up to the macro editing window, it just makes things a little bit easier to see. So what we want to focus on is the values in macro 2, macro 6, and macro 10, because this is all controlling the level and the distortion amount. So if we start with macro 2, we have shaper 1 amount. We're going to leave that from 0 to 100, that's fine. But what we're going to do is we're going to invert, instead of it going from minus 24 decibels up to 24 decibels, we're also going to limit the range as well. So we're going to start at positive 10, and we're going to have it go down to minus 10. So the more distortion that we push through that band, the quieter the level gets. This allows us to get out of the territory of extreme dynamic change in loudness. And especially when we're working with distortion, it can be a little bit dangerous if you've got things turned up very loud. So I'm just going to do the other values. So minus 24 we'll change to 10, and then invert with minus 10 on the other side, and then the same for the other one. So now all three of these bands, the more the amount is pushed on each of these distortion bands, the level becomes quieter. And if we turn the mapping off, we can test that now. As you can hear, the level doesn't really change now, it just turns into different types of distortions every time I press the randomize button. Now that's the main thesis of this video, is how to create infinite distortion types using Ableton Live 12's RAW by pressing the randomize button in Effects Rack. I'm going to show you how you can extend this further so you can get some more interesting sounds, and also refine a little bit of the top end as well. So while experimenting with this effects rack, I found some extra features in RAW that I found helped refine the sound a little bit more. So in the tone section to the left, this is defaulted to 180 Hz. I found increasing this to 2 kHz just created a better tone overall for the distortion types. Another thing I did was increase the compression all the way to 100%, and this allowed for less overall massive changes in loudness as we press the randomize button on the effects rack. Another feature that you can see highlighted in blue here is delay amount and dry wet. RAW includes a feedback mode, which I decided to change to dotted, eighth note, and set the amount range from 0 to 60%. Also, when you put an instance of RAW into Ableton Live, the feedback gate is always turned on. So if you turn that off, this allows for some really interesting and unique things to happen with the delay, which if I just randomize a few times and turn the delay amount up, I just want to show you something that's really interesting with this. So now that I've stopped the sound, I've now created an infinite feedback loop. I'm messing around with the filters and get some really new and interesting sound design. Now I didn't know that this was a possibility within RAW. But this can definitely add for some interesting things and new sounds that you might not have explored before. And you can turn that off just by turning the delay amount all the way down to 0%. But back to this button here, if it's highlighted in yellow or whatever colour you have your template in Ableton Live set at, it will stop after a certain amount, because what this feedback gate is doing is stopping any delay after there is no signal input. But by turning it off, that's how we can get into that infinite delay amount. I also changed the frequency width, and this is basically just the delays filter. I set it to a midpoint about 1.31 kHz and set the bandwidth to 5.35. You can do this to taste. This is what I decided to choose for this. I also mapped the dry wet as well to a macro. So if we only want a small amount of this with the original signal, we can then turn the overall sound of RAW down. And also have a blend between the two, which I think is a cool feature as well. Now you may be noticing as I press randomize, these three values here aren't changing. And if you're setting this rack up for yourself, this is very easy to set up, and you just go in and you exclude macro from randomization, which is another really cool feature of this, because if you're randomizing and you found that the low band actually creates a distortion type that you really like, but you're still not sold on the upper ones, then you can exclude those macros from randomization and then start randomizing again. So just a little feature in the effects rack for you to have a play around with, which can be really useful. Now the final refinement I've added to this effects rack is the smooth switch and the smooth amount. And this is an effects rack within an effects rack. So if we move over here, what I've got is a 2-band frequency splitter, a low pass filter at 1 kHz and a high pass filter at 1 kHz as well. And on the high pass filter band, I have an envelope follower that is only following the high frequencies. And after this, I've added another EQ8 with another high pass filter. And on band 4, I have a high shelf, and the envelope follower is mapped to the gain of that high shelf. So basically what happens is it's following all of the high frequencies above 1 kHz. And if they get a little bit too loud, this high shelf dips down in level. So think of this basically as it's smoothing out the top end of the overall raw distortion sound. And if we come back to these two controls here, the smooth switch can turn it off and turn it on. So you can have just the raw by itself as bright and loud as it is, or you can turn it on, and that's when the smoothing of the high end kicks in. And this smooth amount basically determines how aggressive it's going to pull down on those high frequencies. But let's see that in action. So I've set the smooth amount to its most aggressive, and let's look at what's happening in that top band. And as you can see, as this envelope follower is receiving anything that's above 1 kHz, it's pulling down up to minus 15 decibels in gain, the area above 1 kHz. This just allows us to smooth out that top end if it's getting a little bit too aggressive. You don't always have to use this, but some distortion types when you're randomizing can get a little bit too aggressive in the top end, so it's useful to have. As we draw this video to a close, you may be asking why would you want to have this sort of randomized infinite raw capability. Now, there's nothing wrong with playing around with raw and sort of tweaking the values by hand, and you can still do that with the effects rack with all of those macros set up. But sometimes a thing that's really cool with sound design is unexpected sounds that might happen. So having that randomized feature, you may never come up with those distortion sounds yourself, or if you do, it would take you a very long time to get to them. So just having that feature of being able to randomize quite quickly to find something, you might end up with a happy accident on your hands where you're like, oh, this is really cool, I can use that in X project or whatever it is you're working on. If you want the rack that I have made, you can find that in the description underneath this video. I hope you have loads of fun with this infinite raw effects rack. And as always, until next time, God bless and goodbye.